Hi, everyone. We're going to wait a little bit for other attendees to join us, and then we'll begin at about in one or two, few more minutes. Okay, should we start, Elke? Great. Okay, everyone. Hi there, and welcome to the lecture program by Elke Krasny, presented by the MAK Center for Art and Architecture. For those of you who are unfamiliar with the MAK Center, we are a Los Angeles-based nonprofit organization whose mission is to steward 3 significant architectural sites by the Austrian-American architect Rudolf Schindler, and to activate them with contemporary art and architecture programming. You know, Elke and I have known each other for quite a few years. I'll offer a brief bio of her practice a little bit in a minute, but I just wanted to say part of the initial momentum around this lecture was question that Elke posed to me as we were in discussion a year or two ago, which was to ask, how do we inhabit the spaces that we inherit? And as an organization like the MAK Center, which stewards both a kind of history of modernist architectural heritage, but often with a deep intention to engage with contemporary culture and to hold those two kind of paradigms together, that question was really provocative for me as a new director of the organization, thinking about how one does work within sites of deep history that we want to connect to both discursively and as these spaces of needing stewardship. So in this way, heritage and contemporaneity and care is always a part of the institutional work that the MAK Center does. And I think for this reason, we're very excited to hear Elke's current work and thoughts around monuments and conflict, care, repair, refuse, resist. So we'll start today with a 50-minute to 1-hour lecture by Elke, and we're going to hold questions at the end, and participants are welcome to raise their hand during the Q&A session or type in their questions in the chat box. Thank you, Elke, so much for joining us from Vienna, and we're glad that this new technological apparatus is allowing us to bring you technically to our sites. Elke Krasny, PhD, professor at the Academy of Fine Arts, Vienna, is a feminist cultural theorist, urban researcher, curator, and author. Her scholarship addresses ecological and social justice at the global present, with a focus on caring practices in architecture, urbanism, and contemporary art. With Angelica Fitz, she edited Critical Care, Architecture and Urbanism for a Broken Planet, and her 2023 book, Living with an Infected Planet. COVID-19 Feminism and the Global Frontline of Care develops a feminist perspective on the rhetoric of war and the realities of care in pandemic times. Elke, I'm going to hand this off to you, and very much looking forward, and thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me and hosting, and for this very kind and generous introduction. I want to thank you, Gia, for the initiative, and also that this can now happen, even though it had been planned for actually much earlier. And also thank you to everyone at the MAK Center who facilitated, organized, and makes it technically possible. I will share some thoughts and ongoing reflections today that I think will allow for, or I hope will allow for us to think about care in more complex ways, and also understand how care, repair, refuse, resist converge as monuments and conflicts come together in our co-joined, if one will. So very broadly, just to set the tone, monuments are statues, buildings, other structures to commemorate notable persons or events. That's the definition that is given of monuments. But they can also be buildings or sites that are considered to be of historical importance. And of course, as Gia already mentioned in the introduction, these sites very often come to us. So we as beings who live now haven't chosen to make them monuments or to erect statues or to inhabit these buildings. So in a way, the question is also how to deal with monuments, statues, buildings, other structures, sites, otherwise or differently. I think it's important to underline that monuments are always between tenses. They are of the past, of the present, and of the future at the same time. So they are conceived of as representation of someone or something at the present time, at the time of making, but they are also conceived of to imagine how the past will be in the future. So in a way, they are occupying or reaching out into the future. They have a very demanding relationship to the time that is not yet there. And in this sense, I think it is very important to understand what we mean when we talk about care for monuments that also ensure that past representations are being here, even though these past representations may today be considered violent, harmful, ideologically fraught, or to be destroyed and removed. Imagining commemoration of the past as future then means that monuments at present represent decisions of how to define the future of monuments or of memory. So in a way, that's a very hegemonic claim to be able to make this or give this definition. In order for monuments to reach into the future, they are strongly connected with imaginaries and realities of permanency. And these imaginaries and realities of permanency are dependent upon laws, legal frameworks, but also, of course, on material conditions and the ways in which permanency is being produced or reproduced. So when we speak about the legal dimensions of monument care, they have to do with this, what we can call the production of permanency. And then people who are dealing with monument care find themselves within legal realities and conditions, but also material realities and spatial realities. These can never be thought of as separate from political and ideological contexts. And between them, there's conflict between all of them. There can be conflict between legal realities and material realities. There can be conflict between material and spatial realities. And there can, of course, be numerous conflicts that are political and ideological in relation to legal, material, and spatial realities. And then monuments and the care for them are deeply connected to ethical and cultural imaginaries. And neither political and ideological contexts nor ethical and cultural imaginaries are static. They are dynamic, they change as they are met by existing legal realities and furthermore, material and spatial realities that make this claim to permanency. When we think of state monument care and how in particular nation states have defined monument care, this care brings together legal, spatial, material, and educational dimensions of protection, repair, maintenance and cleaning, but also of cultural and educational reproduction in the sense of information, research, knowledge production, and teaching about monuments. Monument care then is produced and ensured by legal protection and material repair. And this is also what is being resisted against or refused. Protection and repair ensure the continued existence and thus the public manifestation and presence of past hegemony. And I only want to quote one of the transnational frameworks that have to do with protection. And I will not go into different state conditions or state laws. The Hague Convention is the Convention for the Protection of Cultural Property in the event of armed conflict. It was adopted in 1954 under the auspices of UNESCO. It's now widely referred to as the 1954 Hague Convention. It's the first and the most comprehensive multilateral treaty dedicated exclusively to the protection of cultural heritage in times of peace, as well as during an armed conflict. And I will come to the second part to raise a number of questions, but now I will just read it. The Hague Convention states that any damage to cultural property, irrespective of the people it belongs to, is a damage to the cultural heritage of all humanity, because every people contributes to the world's culture. So that's the preamble. And what I would like to ask is, what about the political, ideological, affective, emotional, epistemic damage caused by cultural property? So what about the violence that people endure because of specific forms of monuments and their presence, their continued presence that is protected by state care? What about the damage to the cultural heritage of all humanity, perpetuated by supremacist forms of care for harmful and violent cultural property, monuments, and sites? What about care in order to provide public protection from monuments? I think this is one of the questions I'm thinking about a lot. So what would be legal, material, spatial conditions in order to provide care that provides the public from violence of monuments? How could thinking with care lead to understanding, as well as resistance and refusal to damage to the public by cultural property, harm by monuments and sites? How can care be a framework to see that and how public violence is committed by cultural property, monuments, and sites and continued by protection and repair? So what if we start to think about monument care in relation to the public violence of monuments? What if we start to look at how artists, activists, groups gathering around monuments enact and practice other forms of care, including repair, resistance, and refusal? And I will now move to the part of the lecture that gives a few examples from different parts of Europe and one from South Africa, where care, repair, refusal, resistance, permanency, removal come together in complex ways. I've visited most of the sites, and when I introduce them, I will also share with you how I researched them or what the sources and conversations were through which I got to know them, through which I did my research. So the first site is in Brussels at the Parc du Cinquantenaire, in Flemish Jubel Park, or Park of the 50th anniversary. And this park exists since 1880. And I'm just sharing here a few images of what this park looks like, which celebrated the 50th anniversary of Belgian statehood. And the year 2030 will mark the 200th anniversary of Belgian statehood. And this park is supposed to play an important role in these practices of commemoration. The federal government of Belgium intends to transform this park and its institutions into a new socio-cultural flagship for Belgium. And the ambition is to turn the site and its institutions into this socio-cultural flagship. So this information can be found on the official website of the Cinquantenaire, activities that are currently being prepared. I want to share with you some of the very humble forms of approaching this celebration. The first one is by a Cameroonian artist based in Belgium. It takes the form of a record as a wooden platform for gatherings where people can enact or do things in public. And it was first used at the Heritage Days in September 2022, and I participated in this gathering. And I'm sorry that I jump back and forth, but before I actually wanted to share these interventions, I wanted to read this to you. What are the material, discursive, affective, emotional, epistemic realities produced by modern buildings and monuments? And Brussels was an important city for critical and decolonial thinking when it comes to how these sites, buildings, and monuments came to exist and what they are when we approach them from something that we might want to call semantic materialism. Thinker on race and Pan-African civil rights activist W.E.B. Du Bois argued, as referenced by critical anthropologist Elizabeth Povinelli, that the material and discursive origins of European monumentalism, such as the gleaming boulevards of Brussels, were found in the brutal colonial regimes of the Congo. And the site, the Cinquantenaire Park, was actually then used for the 1897 International World's Fair that presented the Congo as a property of the king. And so there is a direct relationship to what we read in this quote by Du Bois and the material reality that we find ourselves in when we visit this park today. One of the monuments we find there is the monument to the Belgian pioneers in Congo. And then there are many other monuments in that park, but also a large number of museums dedicated to military history, to art history, and to other dimensions of historical commemoration. And so now I'm moving back to these humble interventions that used forms of placing themselves next to, but also keeping a distance, even if the distance is only a few inches of being removed from the ground, or keeping a distance from the monuments, while inviting people to be in the park and engage in conversations, debates, discussions as to what its future inhabitation and use might be. The second intervention was by Bara movement, which is a large group of people from different parts of the world that all find themselves connected to Brussels at the moment, and that work a lot with public performance and ritual in order to practice around questions of healing, commemoration, and maybe one could say also inhabiting public spaces together differently. The next example I want to share with you is one that I haven't visited, but have done a lot of research through publications, all kinds of different publications, newspapers, archival materials, published books, lectures that were given at the time by internationally active philosophers like Achille Mbembe, and a lot of other different materials in order to constitute and understand what happened to this monument that I will in a minute introduce to you. So the location we find ourselves in is Cape Town and the University of Cape Town. And the park we just looked at was established in 1880 and the university a bit earlier, so in 1829. And this is what the photograph you can find online of the University of Cape Town, established in 1829 as the South African College. And in front of this university was a statue dedicated to Cecil John Rhodes. He was an imperialist colonizer of large parts of South Africa. mining magnate, and the colonies of northern and southern Rhodesia were named after him. They had his name inside of their name, Zambia and Zimbabwe, respectively. The statue was sculpted and established in the year of 1934 by Marion Walgate, by an early female sculptress, and Françoise Vergès, decolonial, Afro-diasporic French activist and thinker, has coined the expression civilizational feminism in order to examine how white women were involved in the production of white supremacy. And I think this is one of the analytical frameworks that we can use in order to examine the statue and its making. Marion Walgate was the wife of the architect Charles Walgate, who actually designed the university's buildings that were situated on land that Rhodes bequeathed to the colony. And in April of 2015, after demonstrations and after the statue had an activist encounter with excrements, there was also a large and globally distributed and shared performance by Setembile Mzezane. She was at the time master student studying there, and she performed during and at the fall of the Cecil Rhodes statue on April 9th, 2015. And the image you're seeing here is an image that was published in The Guardian. And in the article that was published alongside the image, there are a number of quotes by the artist. And she stated that one of her main concerns was that she wanted to have something that was going up or being raised while the statue was going down and being removed. So she wanted to counteract this movement. And I will read from the Guardian article. I believe that South Africa's memorialized public spaces are barren of the Black female body. So last year, so that was the year 2014, I started doing performance art. I'm a fine art student at the University of Cape Town, to draw attention to the issue. And then she describes a number of living statues that she described in public space, and goes on to say that the character I'm portraying here depicts the statue of the Zimbabwe bird that was wrongfully appropriated from Great Zimbabwe by the British colonialist Cecil Rhodes. It currently still sits in the estate that had belonged to Cecil Rhodes. And bird she referenced here is the Zimbabwe birds, the famous soapstone bird carvings that stood on walls and monoliths of the ancient city of Great Zimbabwe, built between the 12th and 15th centuries by the ancestors of the Shona, which is also explained in her work in more detail. So I also want to point out that the Rhodes activism against Rhodes statues did not only occur in South Africa, but also in the UK. And it was a large student-led activist movement and led to a number of publications. One of the books that was published is the Rhodes Must Fall book, that also connected the statute to necessary changes in structures of fees and curricula. So the material and the immaterial in how universities are being inhabited and how the public spaces of universities that are occupied by statues are being decolonized is discussed in this book. And At the same time, in 2015, a lot of public figures, intellectuals responded to the removal and fall of the statue. The constitutional lawyer of South Africa, Lwando Schaso, described this in the following words. She stated, "I think statues represent so many ideas that are wrapped up in the physical object itself. And that by toppling them, you're saying that those ideas that they represent no longer have a place in society." Philosopher Achille Mbembe stated the following: "To those who are still in denial, it might be worth reiterating that Cecil Rhodes belonged to the race of men who were convinced that to be Black is a liability. During his time and life in Southern Africa, he used his considerable power, political and financial, to make Black people all over Southern Africa pay a bloody price for his beliefs. His statue and those of countless others who shared the same conviction has nothing to do on a public university campus 20 years after freedom." And he goes on to say, "The debate, therefore, should have never been about whether or not it should be brought down. All along, the debate should have been about why did it take so long to do so." And the entire script of this lecture by Mbembe can be found online. And I put the link here so that people can retrace the entire text. To bring Rhodes' statue down is far from erasing history. So this is one of the arguments that is very often being made, that when statues disappear, history disappears. So I really want to underline, to bring a statue down is far from erasing history. And nobody should be asking us to be eternally indebted to Rhodes for having donated his money and for having bequeathed his land to the university. If anything, we should be asking, how did he acquire the land in the first instance? The debate over statues is always a debate about more than statues. The transformation of the curriculum so that it reflects who we are, where we came from, where we are struggling, and where we want to go. In the case of the ongoing debates in the US, in the UK and Germany, in France and elsewhere, the key issues are, of course, those of racial justice. So with this, I will move to the next case study I would like to share with you. So this is a statue 2B in Copenhagen in front of the former West Indian warehouse, which now houses since 1895 the Royal Cast collection. And here I visited the site, and I also conducted an interview with one of the artists, Jeanette Ehlers, who conceived of this project. And before I go into it, I also want to point out that this is an artist-led project, so a project that is not a commissioned project, but a self-initiated project that resulted in a temporary statue and may still result in a permanent statue. So this is the building of the Royal Cast collection in Copenhagen. It's the most expansive collection of casts in Europe. And these cast collections were actually like giving models to sculptors and sculptresses who were few at the time, who were commissioned to sculpt for the imperial colonial infrastructure of modern cities in the 19th and 20th centuries. And this is a David replica that is standing in front of this building that houses the Royal Cast collection today. And when you stand in front of the building, you're actually looking at the sea. So before we look at the second monument that is supposed to join this statue, I will say a little bit about why this was the West Indian warehouse. The US Virgin Islands, so the territory that is now called US Virgin Islands since 1917, was a Danish colony between 1672 to 1917. In 1916, the question about whether or not to sell the islands in the West Indies became the first ever referendum in Denmark. The Danes emphatically said yes to the sale, 64% in favor. Then the parliament could approve the agreement and the islands were transferred to the US on March 31st, 1917. And the planned statue is actually two statues, one on the Virgin Islands and one in Denmark. And this is what the statue is supposed to look like. It's a collaborative project by two artists, one based in Copenhagen and one based on the Virgin Islands, Jeanette Ehlers and Lavon Bell. And this is the temporary monument that was installed here in 2008. And the monument is actually made of styrofoam, so it's a very lightweight monument. And in a storm in 2020, the monument had to be taken down. And since then, the plinth is actually empty. The person who is sitting here is Queen Mary. She's one of the three rebel queens. Even after the abolition of slavery, conditions in the Danish colony were very tough. Frustration and unrest were brewing. In 1878, a violent rebellion took place in which houses, sugar mills, sugar fields, and over half the city of Fredrikstad burned down. 3 women, who were then named in commemoration rebel queens, Mary, Agnes, and Matilda, were especially active in the rebellion. Today, they are considered heroines in the islands. And as Jeanette Ehlers explained in the interview and also in texts that can be found on a website that holds a lot of information on the monument, is inspired by the leader of the Black Panther Party. And so she took this historical photograph, and in a way, the person that you see seated is the 2 artists, and their bodies morphed or brought together to form a new transnational commemorative body for personifying or literally embodying Queen Mary. In 2020, the cultural minister, so the Danish government in the form of the cultural minister, granted permission to permanently install I Am Queen Mary in front of a former colonial warehouse in Copenhagen, acknowledging the work's shift from a temporary artwork to an important landmark in the city. Yet there was no care for money that the statue could actually be built. To now build the permanent sculpture and the twin monument on St. Croix, US Virgin Islands, an international funding campaign began in August 2021. And the 2 artists are still working on funding their collaborative project. And in July 2023, when I visited, this is what the plinth of I Am Queen Mary looks like now. The next example that I would like to go into is located in Athens. It's Plato's Academy Park. And this I know through being in friendship and exchange, and also sometimes collaboration with Julia Strauss, who has initiated Autonomy Academia, self-run, durational, educational, and artist-run para-institution and art project that for 10 years has worked in Plato's Academy in this park in Athens. So this is what the park looks like today. It's a large expanse, green expanse in an otherwise underserved neighborhood of Athens, underserved with green spaces, that is. And the park is very much used by local people from the neighborhood, many of them diasporic or immigrant. So it's one of the archaeological sites in Athens that is still publicly accessible, that is not run over by mass tourism, and that is not gated in the sense that you have to pay entrance. It's an archaeological site since 1929 when excavations began, but the site has been in existence as a green space, or what we call a park, since 387 BC, before Christ, when Plato's Academy was first founded. And this is what the mayor of Athens, Kostas Bakogiannis, wrote in 2021. The promotion of the archaeological site, so we can consider this a monument of Plato's Academy, and the creation of the Archaeological Museum of Athens, in addition to their historical and cultural significance, create a great opportunity for the entire area. So I'm going back to this image. The value of land has risen significantly around the park, and a lot of land has been sold and bought by people who have the means to buy land that is rising in value. The mayor of Athens argued for a renovation of the archaeological site to make it more appealing to visitors. This translates into tourists, promotion as an attraction of cultural and historical significance. And for that reason, there was an architectural competition launched. So just to remind us that these are the ways in which Plato is being commemorated materially, through imagery, through archaeological remnants, but of course also through ways of publishing, etc., etc. Today we can find in Domus magazine, in the Zine, but also in many other architectural publications, what the park is. We can find renderings, so we can see the winning entry and what the park is supposed to look like. And this is promoted as Athens' first green museum. At the same time, as part of the city of Athens' promotion of Plato's Academy, there are plans to redesign the green area with the creation of a park under the banner of sustainability and future viability. It's branded as the first green museum in Greece, where Plato's Academy was located. The competition was won by Tsolakis. It's an Athenian firm. They also build a lot on many Greek islands. And they will design a new archaeological museum, largely underground, in the park that once housed the famous philosophical school. In 2023, Julia Strauss wrote in an essay that is included in a book that I co-edited with Lara Pera on Curating with Care. She wrote the following: Autonomy Academia is a self-organized grassroots university as a durational artwork. This university takes place in the garden in Athens where Plato taught, the Academia Platonos. Originally, this academy was a military gymnasium, and Plato was invited to join it to broaden the horizons of the male warriors. Training the youth into a condition of serving the militarized state is the oldest, most continuous European dispositif, Strauss writes. This is what Autonomy Academia rewrites. Our dispositif is gentle, kind, and lush. The Academia Platonos is the etymological root of the academy as an institution of education. So what I would like to point out here is that in my understanding, autonomy academia is a kind of memory work, of ongoing work with an existing monument in the form of taking care of trying to repair, but also refuse and resist. And I will show you a couple of photographs of gatherings that have taken place also during the pandemic in Plato's Academy. And I will share some more of the essay. The concepts of discipline, and indeed that of disciplines as such, stem from it, from Plato's Garden, from the Academy, as does the militarized state binary oppositions, the invention of a narrow and nationalist Europe, and the separation of culture from nature. The culture of this garden is the root of the Anthropocene. Plato's Politeia, translated to English as the Republic, has preconditioned the empire at war with nature, where we still live. Autonomy Academia writes a new Politeia without Plato. It overrides the existing Politeia as a siren would the Odyssey. It celebrates the garden's very existence as a public space. And I would say adds to forms of inhabitation, everyday and mundane forms of habitation, art making that doesn't displace what is already going on, as it comments throughout millennia, to go back to the text. Thanks to the communities that have been living with this garden and protecting it down the generations. There was already an other plan to make better and more profitable use of the site. There was supposed to have been a shopping mall called Academy Gardens being built by BlackRock, but this was being resisted against, successfully resisted against, and it is much harder to resist and refuse a museum than to resist a shopping mall. The Academy Gardens in Athens is a world-renowned cultural heritage site, as we already know by now. It's also a precious public space at the heart of local cultural life. A new shopping mall project threatens to permanently damage this irreplaceable site. And back then in 2008, there was a petition that stated, we still have time to act until construction will begin, and we need your help to mobilize international resistance. So a form of not having existing monuments gentrified or used differently is the form of organizing international pressure and petitions. The Academy Gardens is a site of World Heritage, and this makes it so interesting to both investors in shopping malls, but also state investment in new museums as globally attractive tourist attractions. In 2021, this was a temporary monument, one could say, that took place as part of Room to Bloom Athens, dedicated that summer to ecofeminism. Currently ongoing is a petition and an activist struggle that seeks to ensure legal rights for Academia Platonos jungle, that is legal rights for nature, and in this sense declaring that this is both a cultural but also a natural site that should be protected. In this petition, we read, "We are one with the jungle, and therefore we extend our human rights to her, the jungle. The decolonial environmental turn of governance is a chance for a planetary politics." I continue quoting, "We, Autonomy Academia, Permaculture School, and many other communities and initiatives around Academia Platonos work on establishing Academia Platonos jungle as a person." And I think this is a very interesting discussion currently, how on one hand we should undo and get rid of monument protection legal frameworks that protect harmful and violent heritage, and on the other hand, how rights can be extended to rivers, mountains, and in the case here, to a garden. The numerous communities that live in, around, and with Plato's Academy, as well as the population of Athens, ask for care for the city with our eyes on the future. Plato's Academy Park must remain open and free from any new structures. And the last part is formulated as follows. Prevent the ecocide of Plato's Academy, the historic public space park. The mayor of Athens, in collaboration with the Minister of Culture, want to implement a development plan that includes the cutting of hundreds of trees that make up the ancient habitat that unites the ruins of Plato's Academy, for the creation of a Museum of Athens, a tourist trap that will be built on this historic site. And when you go to the website, you can still sign the petition. And in summing up, I want to go through what these different cases that I presented here mean in relation to care and conflict, to thinking about care as conflict, and to think more complexly how care is implicated in conflict and violence, but also how we need other forms of yet to be imagined care in order to to be more consistent and insistent and resistant when it comes to care as violence. So hence dimensions and implications of care and care, repair, refusal, and resistance. And I've been thinking about care through the work of John Tronto for quite a long time now. One of the books I'm citing here is the 1995 book, Moral Boundaries, A Political Argument for an Ethic of Care. And Tronto writes here, what is definitive about care seems to be a perspective of taking the other's needs as the starting point for what must be done. I think the difficult thing to understand is what the other's needs are and who these others are. So are the others sites, environments, human beings, other living beings? And also, when we understand all of their care needs, these are in conflict with each other. And then whose care needs are more important than other care needs? So while this is a very useful definition, it also tells us that we need much more work on understanding the conflicts that result from it, and the political and ethical procedures of decision-making that are needed in order to decide whose care needs are to be taken care of in order for monuments and sites to have a future. I also want to share two more recent publications, one by myself and one by a friend and colleague that I think have to do with what I discussed today. So one is an essay called Implicated in Care, Haunted by Protection, on the violence of bronze and stone bodies. And in this essay, I'm particularly interested in figurative sculptures that are co-present with living human beings in physical urban spaces. And this is included in the book in Infrastructural Love, Caring for Our Architectural Support Systems, edited collaboratively by Frichot, Carbonell, Frikorm, and Karami. And the second book is by a friend of mine and colleague whose work I've known for over 20 years now. And her most recent book is this one, Monumental Cares, Sites of History and Contemporary Art. And here in particular, she develops an ethics of care in relation to public art. And also what I learned from her is that one can use the word care as a plural noun, cares, which I found extremely inspiring to think about also the plural conflicts that reside in cares. And I will now sum up the different forms of care that we have seen. So when we think back to what happened in Brussels, we had an overwriting and a gentle overwriting and gathering as forms of care. creating sites and performances otherwise next, within, in, next to, and adjacent to existing sites in order to engage in very conflictual and very difficult conversations and the labor of how to inhabit sites that make a violent past present differently. The second example from Cape Town showed us that care can take the form of attack, and that removal is a form of care, and that this kind of care results in and produces the ending of the occupation of sites. So what I would like to suggest is, or what I've been thinking about is that monuments that are violent and harmful to publics are actually occupying sites. So these sites are under occupation by monuments. And when these monuments are being removed, there is a form of restitution of public space to the public. In the example in Copenhagen, I think we have a specific form of unsilencing as a form of care, of unsilencing what was absent and missing from commemoration, and at the same time keeping the unfinished and yet to come there in the form of an empty plinth that now resides in the place and also holds the place for a monument to still come. So not to give way, but to remain in space, even though the monument in its imagined, planned, and designed form has not been realized yet. So in a way, it's a monument to the yet to come. In relation to the Athens example of Plato's Academy, I think that the practice renders legible the uncare, dispossession, and displacement that takes place in the name of urban generation and urban redevelopment, which actually takes place under the guise of care. So caring better for the park, making it more attractive for a new and more affluent publics. And the form of care we see here is resisting in form of protests and petitions as a form of care. The framework that Joan Tronto has developed actually much earlier in the 1990s, but I quote here from a publication called Who Cares that was published in 2013, and where she added the last part is the caring with part is the following. And I think it can become a useful framework to think about care in plural, cares, and conflicts in plural, and how the different care needs, when we place them in conflict next to each other, require publics to act politically and ethically for care decision-making. So this framework includes caring about, caring for, caregiving, and care receiving, which we can all apply to material, immaterial, spatial, and legal dimensions of monument sites and buildings. The last step that Toronto added in 2013 is the caring with part. And I would like to the caring with conflicts. And with this, I would like to end the lecture part for today.
Thank you, Elke. That was wonderful. I have a few questions, and I think our audience members might as well, but maybe I will give them a few minutes to kind of muster that, and I will start with mine. Is that okay? Great. I mean, it's just really interesting your research that's been ongoing for a while. My first question is thinking about the different entities that govern and manage the sites that you've studied. Are they all at the scale of a state body or a kind of larger legislative entity? Or are they more like municipally owned, or even that is quite. I'm thinking about this in the context of the kinds of monumentalism we see in Los Angeles, which is residential and domestic. And we don't quite have the same, um, especially coming out of an institution that's protecting a modernist house. So first, I just wanted to understand the entities of power that are being represented in the monumental spaces that you are exploring. And then I actually will speak to the artist, but yeah.
Yeah, that's a really important question. So very often both state and municipal level converge in these sites in complex ways. But the case studies I've been following or I'm interested in all have to do with what we could call state power, and very much to do with the making of the nation state, both the building of new monuments, but also very often archaeology. So the excavation of a past for the making of the modern nation state. When it comes to land ownership, where these different monuments that I presented actually stand on, sometimes they stand actually at boundaries, so that the state and the municipal level, like in Copenhagen, actually come together, and they need to also come together in decision making when new things are being decided. And I guess that Julia might be in the audience, Julia Strauss. She might know more about the legal dimensions in Athens. But as far as I know, it's managed by a, a public state entity, the Academy of Athens, that has been the legal, let's say, guardian of this park for the last more than 100 years. But then laws, there are different laws. There are also European laws in that case, because when you have a public competition for a new museum that scale, you have to have a European-wide public competition. So it's transnational, national, and municipal. And then very often these sites can also be or become World Heritage sites. So then we have an other layer of laws that actually are interwoven in the state laws, and how they all come together to create these imaginaries of permanency. I find very important to understand. So not only that they safeguard harmful and violent, sometimes, not always, but also that they're actually weaving different scales of legal frameworks into each other for protective measures.
Mm, super. I think also what I appreciate of the case studies that you're showing and thinking broadly about artistic practices engaging with monuments is their intention not only to drive new interpretations, but to layer the interpretations. And I think, especially in these institutions, that all the work within the institution is to allow for that imagination of permanency, as you're saying, or to the need to feel stable. But what I've appreciated of the works, especially in I Am Queen Mary, is this kind of idea that we all can also remember that interpretation itself is unfinished and, let's say, historically conditional, and that if we, as we are all in some ways historical subjects, um, to invite more interpretation onto sites and to invite more unfinished and, let's say, incomplete interpretations is an important value to hold as we think about monument care. I see there's another question in the audience. Maybe it needs to be typed. I don't think audience and speak. Oh, Seymour. Oh, good.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Thank you so much for your lecture. It's super interesting, and this is something that I think a lot about as well. Something that I kind of came upon and have been thinking about recently is this is I'm coming from the US, so from a US perspective, I recently kind of noticed that the Lincoln Memorial was established in 1922 and the Vietnam Memorial was established in 1982, so about 60 years difference, which kind of historically is not a very long amount of time, and they're basically directly adjacent to each other. And they're dramatically different in the way that they kind of memorialize. The Lincoln Memorial is this Greek revivalist classical structure, extremely, extremely massive, um, very kind of empirical. And I think the Maya Lin's Vietnam Memorial was kind of noted for kind of representing maybe a different side. You know, it's often compared to a wound or something like that for the Vietnam War veterans. And I guess something that I was thinking a lot about is A, that's a really short amount of time to be kind of changing the way that the uh, the nation kind of memorializes its history. You know, I think it's impossible to kind of look back at Abraham Lincoln without thinking about the Civil War and the emancipation of slavery and things. But the other thing is just sort of how a nation like the US kind of designates these official monuments. In kind of changing attitudes and things and how they become a reflection of the time. And the other thing that's also kind of upsetting is that you know, a lot of these sort of things haven't um, changed. So when Lincoln is memorialized, this is still, you know, deep Jim Crow territory era. And you know, even after the Vietnam War, there's been plenty of colonial violence from the American Empire. So I guess I was just wanted to kind of see your thoughts on how these monuments can reflect national values and how they kind of reflect their time, but also how they kind of function as a almost like a thought process or a feeling or kind of an emotional response to something, um, even when that's kind of in conflict with the reality, if that makes sense.
I'm not quite sure. I'm fully clear what the question is. So if these are representative of values today,
Oh, sorry,
as
maybe I can clarify. I guess it seems as if from the representations of the monuments, there is some sort of progress or kind of like change of values, it would seem, based on the way that these monuments are memorializing these topics. Um, and I guess I just wanted to ask about the relationship between kind of uh, people's sentiments about these historical moments and their reflections in monuments.
well, I think people's sentiments are very clearly expressed in people's reactions to monuments, and these are individual, collective, dynamic, changing over time, and extremely conflictual. I think this is precisely what monuments have been doing, not just today, but also in their own time. I don't think there's one feeling evoked by one monument. I think, as Gia was saying before, multiple feelings, multiple readings, but it's precisely the multiple readings is not just joyful multiple readings, it's also conflicted and ideological multiple readings. And monuments, I think, attract these strong feelings.
Thank you, Elke. I think that perhaps perhaps one more question from the audience, or I have more, and then we can conclude the discussion today. I was curious, so I'm a little bit thinking through your own curatorial research process, and your kind of, I would actually like to speak more to your methods over the subjects that we've been bringing into discussion. Could you speak to us a little bit the origins of the project for you, which began with some of your early interest in feminist care practices? You've always been a kind of theorist that's worked at the intersections of feminist theory, art, architecture, and care. And I think recently, having really developed an interest in these spaces of monuments, I would just love to hear a little bit more, how that evolved, where a next step might be for you in your research, and what are some kind of upcoming projects that you're working on.
Oh, that's really a big question. Thank you. I think what I'm more and more troubled by is the way in which, in the name of care, violence has been perpetrated. And we could think of coinages like death by the welfare state, that withholds care for bodies or people. And what I want to understand is how one can develop, coming from a feminist care ethical and feminist Marxist social reproduction background, understanding how to maybe proliferate the meanings of care. So still fight for better care, and that includes better care for monuments, but at the same time understanding the violence that is very often inherent in hegemonic forms of care, and you could say enshrined in it. And at the moment, I'm looking at this through the lens of monuments, but I think you could use other typological and other functions. I mean, we could look at hospitals in order to understand hegemonic care and non-hegemonic care. So I think there are many places in order to continue this kind of research. I guess what I find interesting about monuments at this moment in time is that the past and the future come together in such a complex way. The crisis of the environment, the disappearance of inhabitability, and on the other hand, the occupation of sites by supremacist or anti-Semitic sculptures is still there. And what is the space for caring differently between those mega pressures? I think that's what I'm thinking about.
No, that's super great. I mean, thinking just even about the kind of 4 to 5 categories of care that you've been presenting today in the lecture, like overriding or care becoming even a possibility of attacking and silencing, are helpful categories as we think through our own work as an institution. And then also thinking about labor on the ground, the types of workers types of workers who need to do the caring and their subject position even within the institutions that frame them and the context of their work. So I think there's a lot for our team to think about as we do the work. And I so appreciate you taking your evening in Vienna with us today to discuss some of your recent projects and curatorial work. Thank you, Elke. I think this concludes the
Thank you,
program.
dear.
Yes.
Thank you.
And I do see Julia Strauss in the audience. Will reach out and see if how her project's going. Meanwhile, thank you everybody who joined us today. We hope that this kind of discourse continues within our institution, but also within our audiences. And we invite you to reach out to us with your thoughts and provocations as well. Okay, Elke. Well,
Goodbye.
goodbye.